Wonderful segue, Paul. Thank you. I was wondering how you were going to get there, but you did a great job. Mike Rowe with Water and Power Authority. Good morning. Good to see you all. It was interesting to hear the mayor speak this morning. I leaned over to Aaron and I said, you know, that man has a voice for radio. And then, sure enough, who knew?
Whereas I have a face for radio.
I was not going to say that, Paul. I actually went back and pulled up this old presentation and said, you know, I think it just needs a bit of updating because we've been talking about this for quite a while. You know, we had strong economic times a few years back, and we were worried about growth and relying too much on growth to pay our way to finance things, and now we're in the opposite situation. So let's talk about project financing and what does a lender look at? What do you need to think about when you have to finance that project? Obviously, we've got supply needs, we've got treatment issues, be it water or wastewater. We've got to find a way to lessen the impact on our users. And I'm going to talk about what does a lender, what do you guys look at? What do you do in that back room back there? So, again, we all know this is redundant. We all know we live in uncertain times with climate issues, droughts, economic situation. You know, in the past, as I mentioned, we experienced significant economic growth. I think Douglas County was in the top 5 growing counties in the country for a significant period of time. And what we saw as a lender were folks coming to us and saying, oh God, the growth will go on forever. We kept saying, you know, at some point it's going to slow down. If you keep saying that for long enough, you'll be right. So, okay, but what happens when you have an economic contraction? Which, you know, we've been dealing with a moribund economy for a while now. So how do you finance projects when you don't have any growth? It kind of all falls on the system users. So. And then I want to talk a little bit about what happens in a drought, because it's a perverse situation when you ask people to conserve and what results from that. So some of the things that folks use to secure a loan, because we're going to ask you how you're going to repay this. Obviously user rates. Some folks like to use tap fees for that. We do fund loans that are secured by sales tax, property taxes, availability to serve, charges, interest income. Those are sort of the sources of repayment. We've seen a few other strange things, but that's typically what we see. I'm going to start talking a little bit about math. One of the first things that we go out and look at is when we take your financials, we look at a 3 to 5 year period of your history and say, okay, with this new debt service, with the amount of debt you're going to take on and how much it's going to cost you to service that debt, we look at what's called a rate covenant. That's basically your revenues minus your expenses covered, and how does that cover debt service? We want to make sure you're covering operation and maintenance expenses, those sorts of things, whatever it takes to operate your system. All right, I'm going to do a little math. I've been accused of being a bean counter, and I say, no, I'm a finance guy, and I have to explain to him what's the difference between a bean counter and a finance guy. You ask a CPA what's 1 plus 1, he'll tell you 2. You ask a finance guy what's 1 plus 1, he'll say what do you want it to be. That's the difference in a nutshell. This is a simple formula. You take your system and you say, okay, what's my total revenue of my system? What are our operation and maintenance expenses? And we tell you, you don't have to worry about depreciation. That's a non-cash expense, so we're kind with respect to that. You don't have to consider depreciation. You divide that by debt service. So what is your coverage? After you take all your revenues and you deduct your expenses, can you pay your debt service? And we tell you that needs to be at least 110% in most cases. That 10% is our ability to go back and rethink that excusing depreciation. That's there, and that's intended to help you save a little money for future capital projects. So, again, we look at your operation and maintenance reserve fund. Typically, that's a 3-month calculation. We look at the end of the year, we look at your audit and say, okay, if you had an emergency situation, do you have sufficient funds to cover 3 months of operation and maintenance? It's a simple test. You don't have to necessarily have a separate reserve fund, but as long as you have that cash at the end of the year, you meet that test. It's pretty simple. We study your user rates and look at those, and how do you compare with other systems in your region? That's important. If you're really out of line, there's a significant difference, that could create a problem. And I've listed the current state averages for water and sewer. It's almost $39 for water and $21.50 for sewer. So we compare the user rates to our regional norms and to the statewide averages. Growth, and how much do you rely on tap fees? Boy, we saw a lot of that here 4 or 5 years ago. Everyone wanted to, well, geez, our tap fees are enormous. Hey, that's great. Why don't you use those tap fees to reduce what you need to borrow, rather than relying on them as a source of revenue to repay the loan in the future. You don't know how long those are going to last. Sustainability, that's a term that EPA likes to use. The authority, our oversight federal agency is the EPA, because we're the state's recipient of grant funding of the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. And so we get to have fun with the EPA all the time. And they come up with this term, sustainability. You have the technical, managerial, and financial capability to operate the system. And they require us to really dig into your capacity. They call it capacity. Whenever I hear the term capacity, I always think of volume. I think they should have used the term capability. Do you have the technical wherewithal to make sure you're operating the system in a fashion meeting either safe drinking water standards or clean water standards? Managerial, obviously, that one's pretty obvious, and financial is obvious as well. Can you sustain your system into the future, covering operation and maintenance expenses and future capital needs? So, thinking about on a broader level, and when folks go out to issue bonds, municipal bonds to raise capital, one of the strongest credits out there in the bond market are water and sewer bonds. Think about it, usually water and sewer systems, they have a monopoly. There's no competition. And folks can't live without water, so it's one of those necessities. It's a natural monopoly, it's a necessity. Rating agencies generally look at that as, hey, that's a good credit people have to use water. So, and I'm going to have to look and see if there's been a more recent study or update. The last one I saw was 2003. The rating agencies did a study on defaults in the water and sewer bond issue world, and it was 0.04%. They're very rare. Now, we've heard about some bankruptcies in California and some other situations, so that may be something that they're watching, monitoring more closely now. What happens with growth slows? We've been experiencing that. Again, if you're relying on those tap fees for debt service, that creates a situation which means you may be looking at increasing rates on your current users. Obviously, we've seen that situation more frequently here. But there are ways to protect yourself against a slowdown in tap fee income. We've seen this, I use the example of the town of Wellington, way north of Fort Collins there, up towards Wyoming border. They had developers in there, oh geez, with these grandiose plans, we're going to have all this growth. We need to build a new wastewater treatment plant. And it has to have all this capacity to handle all these new homes. And what we suggested to them is go to those developers and tell them to put their money where their mouth is. enter into a tap purchase agreement that has a schedule of taps they're going to purchase. You've got it scheduled out so you know what your income is. And actually, in this case, we said suggested because there was concern about the creditworthiness and the long-term viability of the developers. Tell them to go to a bank and get a letter of credit to back it up. And actually, they had a situation where one of the developers went out of business, and they had to, fortunately another developer picked it up, but they were about ready to go to the bank and call on that line of credit. So, but that helps bolster the security when you're trying to finance a project. We also allow for folks to create what we call a rate stabilization fund. What you don't want to have happen is to be adjusting your rates up and down over time. Obviously, folks want to cover inflation, so they may have automatic increases of a couple of % per year, but you don't want to do big increases and decreases in your user rates. So we allow folks to set aside, if they want to call, it's just cash, basically available cash. If they want to set up a rate stabilization fund, if in a year where they don't meet the rate covenant, rather than raise their user rates, they can go back and look at the rate stabilization fund and consider that revenue for the purposes of that calculation, so that you're not making these adjustments all the time. Drought. Some of the big systems have seen this. You make a pronouncement, you ask your users to conserve, and they do a wonderful job. They conserve so much so that you reward them with a user rate increase. That's a tough situation, but the systems have obligations to meet, debt service to pay, so that's a challenge. I'm not sure, other than having reserve funds, I'm not sure how you overcome that. That's I think Denver Water experienced that. Geez, I think with the drought, was it after 2002? They asked folks to conserve. They conserved 25%, and they were rewarded with an 8% water rate increase. Although water rates in Denver are still cheap. Just to kind of summarize this a little bit, and then I'm going to give you a few other numbers because we like numbers. Kind of what do we look at as a lender when you're going to go finance that project? We look at your system revenues. Are you relying on growth? What are your user rates compared to your neighbors, and then statewide? Other forces, market, credit issues. Obviously, we've seen that, in large measure over the last few years. Drought. What's your water supply like? Can you, do you have the wherewithal to sustain a drought? And we've seen some systems, I think in Teller County here most recently, where they're literally running out of water, and there are systems that have to truck water in. So, especially these small, more of a homeowners association system, we've seen that before, and I know that actually folks are asking around right now, if you know of any, let us know. We'll talk to the Department of Local Affairs and the Water Quality Control Division. We're there to help those folks find at least a temporary solution. Project size and cost, obviously, and I'll show you with some numbers here in a second. They just seem to get bigger and more expensive, and with new drinking water standards that can come online, with new effluent standards. Bob, I'm not going to mention the nutrient study and Regulation 85 and what's coming down the road with respect to changing standards and what it will cost to meet those standards. So, talk about numbers. These in Don and Diane, Don Ament and Diane Hoppy will appreciate this, since they were our sponsors on a number of occasions with our joint resolution that has a list of all the projects that we're aware of and what we can finance through our state revolving fund programs. On the left-hand side there, you see the drinking water project eligibility list from just the last 5 years. And you see the number of projects is relatively stable, but if you look at those dollar amounts, those estimated costs, goes from $1.8 billion in 2009 to almost $3.3 billion in 2013. That's significant. And if you look at the percent change, I was interested. I hadn't really done this calculation before, but I wanted to see what kind of change were we talking about over these years. On the wastewater side, similarly, we had basically stable number of projects, but you look at those estimated costs, $2.6 billion in 2009 to almost $5 billion in 2013. Significant increase in estimated costs. And this is simply a look at the number of projects. Again, really the number of projects have stayed relatively the same. It's the amount that we all have to pay for those projects that's gone up significantly. So I think with that, I will wrap it up and ask for questions of myself or any of our panel members. So thank you very much, and we appreciate you guys being here, patient. I wish I brought my jacket.
So I don't know what the Colorado Water Resources Power Development Authority really is. It's an authority. So are you a taxing authority? What's your source of funds, and what's your mission?
Wonderful question. Colorado Water Resources and Power Development Authority was created in 1981 by the legislature. We're not a state agency. We're a political subdivision of the state. So we're not a state agency. We did get some initial funding when it was created from the Water Conservation Board, actually, the construction fund, of $30 million, a little over $30 million. And actually the Water and Power Authority Board, one of their first actions was to set aside a good portion of that as a state match for the Animas La Plata project. But really the intent of the authority when it was first created, yes, it had the ability to finance projects, but really we did a bunch of studies. It was a bunch of engineers sitting around doing storage studies. Where could we do storage, additional storage? Then we really evolved when they created a state revolving fund under the Clean Water Act. The authority was identified as the state's grant recipient. And we worked in partnership with the Water Quality Control Division, Department of Local Affairs to administer that program. So the authority, to get to your question about funding for the Water Pollution Control Revolving Fund, that's the clean water side of things, most of the funding comes from through EPA. So it's a federal grant. There's 50 state programs. Similarly, in 1996, they created the Safe Drinking Water State Revolving Fund under the Safe Drinking Water Act. That's when they started providing financing or funding appropriations for that. So currently, I think we did have a transfer or two with some funds back in the 90s, but we received no appropriations from the legislature. We operate independently. I don't know, have you heard of the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority? Housing and Finance Authority does mostly housing, but they can do industrial development projects as well. We're the same thing as the Housing and Finance Authority, except we do water and sewer. So
you're separate from the CWCB revolving fund?
Yes.
But are you subject to the same possibility of being rated?
Well, there has been occasions where certain legislators have come over and asked for contributions for things. The answer is, probably most any of that kind of thing is possible. The revolving funds are created and they're set aside. They're supposed to last in perpetuity. That's why they're called a revolving fund. Because there's federal funds in there, I don't think you could rate those funds. I think those are pretty well protected. We may have some other resources that would be subject to that.
I have a question that, since you're talking about federal funds, and this is not a good question, but what impact is potential for your authority based on what we're seeing with funding cuts at the federal level. Have you seen that impact on your authority, or what do you anticipate the impact of that to be on your authority?
Actually, since 2008, with the capitalization grants that we were awarded 2009, and then we got a special award under the Recovery Act. We received, for both programs, the total was about $64 million. The funding levels the last few years has actually been much higher than it was in 2007 and 8. But we suspect that that's about to decline significantly with the sequestration. Sorry, I had to bring that word up. But
I was trying to avoid that.
I know.
Yes, sir.
Is there going to be a cut due to sequestration? Yes, there is. Actually, it's on an $11 million grant under the Clean Water Program. It's about $547,000. And under the Drinking Water Program, it's a little over $1 million on a $50 million grant. So they're not big. Do they have an impact? Certainly, because that means they won't be able to revolve into the future as loans are repaid, to make new loans. So, but we expect a substantial reduction in those grants in the future.